Hello, I am glad to have you with us. I'm Danielle Walker, reporter at SC Magazine, and I would like to welcome you to today's webcast entitled The Latest Threats on iOS and Android and What You Can Do About It. This webcast is sponsored by Marble Security. Presenting today is Dave Jevons. He is the chairman and CTO of Marble Security, and he's also currently serving as the chairman on the Anti-Phishing Working Group. Marble Security is a California-based mobile security management provider, so obviously Dave is well-versed on the latest mobile threats, including those on the iOS and Android platform. Today, he'll discuss how malicious apps collect sensitive data, many times, unbeknownst to mobile users, and even how some of the legitimate apps leak your personal or corporate information. He'll even show you how you can take over an iPhone in 2 simple clicks. So with that, I will turn things over to Dave. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Danielle, for that great introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. At any time, if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A box. Should be at the bottom of your screen. You don't have to hold them to the end, so if you have questions as we're moving through the materials, feel free to ask them there, and I will endeavor to answer them as we go along. Today, what I thought would be of interest to everyone would be to look at our app risk report for January 2014. We're going to discuss our analysis of risky and malicious apps, and I'm going to give you some statistics and some information and some detail about apps that pose risks both to consumers as well as enterprise employees. I want to share with you some information about the latest mobile rootkit and first bootkit that has been developed and is on the wild. We'll have a brief discussion about jailbreak jammers. These are pieces of malware that prevent MDM clients from detecting if an iPhone is jailbroken. As Danielle said, I'll show you how to take over an iPhone in 2 to 3 clicks. We'll talk a little bit about Wi-Fi attacks, APTs through the mobile channel, and what you can do about it. This is just a brief plug for the APWG conference. That is the Counter E-Crime Operations Summit. That's going to be April 8th through 10th in Hong Kong. And we would really appreciate folks who are working in the electronic crime industry to consider attending this great conference. We run these 2 or 3 times a year, and this proves to be really great. We get a couple hundred people there. You can network with top security folks, folks from the financial services industry, government, and some of the top researchers in malware and electronic crime. So let's jump in. Bring your own device is a trend that we're seeing more and more. People want to use their iPhones, their Androids, their pads, their own notebooks to connect into corporate networks, to get email, to get documents, to connect out to web services that corporations are using. But we're finding out that there's a whole new set of threats on these devices that are changing very quickly, and we're going to go through a number of them today. One is that you've got multiple users per device. If you're not controlling that device, somebody's kids might be using that device. Maybe they jailbroke or rooted it. Who knows what applications they've downloaded to it. We also find that users are connecting to 10 or more different networks a month, and this exposes them to a whole set of risks around Wi-Fi hotspots, and we'll talk about some of those. The reason this is important is that attacks against end users not only put corporate data at risk, but also puts access to the corporate network at risk. So don't just think about a mobile device as a place where someone's got email stored that somebody might be able to copy and read. Think about a mobile device as a way that accesses your corporate network, especially if they've got VPN on that device, and that poses a whole new set of risks about letting APTs into your network, letting apps scan your internal network. And by the way, cyber criminals know this. I've got one question. Is there a domestic conference? I'm assuming this is just back to the APWG slide. We do have domestic conferences. The last one we did was a couple of months ago in San Francisco. But keep an eye on apwg.org and you'll be able to see where we're holding our next conferences. But yes, typically we hold a conference in the United States, one in Europe and one in Asia every year. I've had a couple of questions just asking, will you get a copy of the presentation? And yes, we will make a copy of the presentation available so you do not have to make notes. User-owned devices are, according to many analysts, more than twice as likely to be infected with malware than corporate-owned devices, which are completely locked down. Doesn't mean corporate devices aren't susceptible to a lot of app risks, and we're going to talk about that, but in the user-owned environment, which is increasingly popular, there's a lot of other risks. This is because there's a growing underground market for mobile attacks, mobile 0 days, and mobile malware. This is a slide from an eCrime mobile market report that APWG published, and you can find that on apwg.org. But this looks at intrusion malware. It looks at surveillance malware and how much it costs to buy this from criminals. Malware on mobile devices targeted at banking theft. I'm going to show you several examples of that, including some things that were fresh from this week. Botnet rentals, malware for SEO and SMS premium services, SMS spam services, that type of thing. So there's a whole underground economy here that grew up in the PC malware world and cybercrime world and has figured out that actually everyone's starting to access networks with their Androids and their iPhones, and they're targeting the criminal economy against those devices. So let's briefly jump in to the app risk report for January 2014. This is based on research done by the Marble Security Labs team. It's a dedicated team of engineers looking for the latest in mobile malware and malicious apps. This report is based on 50,000 apps that we scanned in January, and we are doing this scanning based on static and dynamic behavioral analysis. So this is static analysis of apps. It is also running apps in sandboxed environments that are instrumented and patched so that we can tell what behaviors the apps are exhibiting, what kind of data they're sending out, even if it's encrypted. And we're also looking at changes in the behavior as they run. So some apps will actually talk out over the network and download either commands or in some cases other app segments and run those. So we're looking at all of that. There is a question about the DoD hardened Android kernel. I'll get to that in a moment. Here's a snapshot of the categories of apps that are included in this research survey for January. You can see that we have scanned financial services, health and fitness, games, social networking. So we've done a fairly broad scan of popular apps across the Android Google Play Marketplace. That is what this is based on. This survey that we're talking about today is not based on apps that could be sideloaded from other sites. We will be publishing that shortly, but you can expect the maliciousness of that to be much higher than the things that are on the Google Play Marketplace. Many apps expose your users to what I call data exfiltration, but basically getting data off the devices or out of online accounts that you and your employees may be using for collaboration. For example, a full 30% of apps are accessing Google accounts, which includes your Google Docs. It means they can copy the docs off of Google, do whatever they wish with them, send them out through email, send them up through HTTP links, etc. So if you're using Google for any type of document collaboration, be aware that 30% of all apps that we looked at in our scan are able to access that data. Now, there's been a lot of talk about privacy leaking apps, so we'll talk about malware in a bit, but let's talk about something even more subtle, which are apps that are legitimate, but either through bugs or through by design, leak information that puts consumers and enterprises at risk. One that was talked about quite widely about a week or two ago was the Starbucks app, which stores user information and passwords in clear text on the smartphone. Now, Starbucks was notified about this in November, but for whatever reason, it was not filtered through to their security department, and so the researcher who discovered this published it in January of this year. This is a problem because it's got credit card information, but it's also got passwords stored in clear text, and as we know, people reuse passwords, and it's very difficult to stop them from doing that. So you've got a risk here just from one of your employees, for example, having this Starbucks app on their phone. If they lose that phone, all those passwords, that password can basically be backed up and pulled in from a backup from anybody plugging that phone in, and you have a risk to the enterprise. So here's another thing to think about around apps and why you need to be looking at app analysis on all of these devices. Legitimate apps may upload your corporate directory to a service in the cloud. Now, most of us are using something like Active Directory to basically put all of our employees' information in, and we sync that up to our iPhones and our Androids so that our employees can look up people's email addresses and phone numbers and whatnot. Apps are reading that data and sending it out over the internet either for malicious purposes or for legitimate purposes, but you have no control about how that data is stored, whether it's encrypted in transmission or storage, and whether it's resold. That data exposes your enterprise to spear phishing and other types of targeted attacks. I don't think there's anybody on this webinar who would think that publishing your Active Directory publicly is a good idea. However, many apps are publishing that information, they're reading it, and they're sending it out over the internet. Let's walk through how an attack can work against a company. If an employee downloads one of these apps unknowingly, or maybe their kid downloads it, it's a game that's got one of these libraries compiled into it, that app can scan for corporate contacts on your employee's device, upload it. The attackers then use that to find key individuals inside your company, target them, and learn more about them, for example, through surveying social networks. We're going to talk about other malicious activities of apps, such as looking at SMS messages and phone messages momentarily. But this gives the attackers targets inside of your company where they can target spear phishing campaigns and malware campaigns against those specific employees. What we have found is that almost every advanced persistent threat, every successful attack inside of companies originates this way, through a targeted attack against a small number of employees. So it's very important that if you're letting people connect into the network, gain access to email, but more importantly, get access to VPN, that you know what's on their device and are able to control it with a risk-based approach. I've got a question from one of our attendees, William. What mobile OS would you use if security and usability are of concern? I'm a personal fan of iOS devices. I use iPhones, but I'm a little biased. I worked at Apple, so maybe I just like that product better. I don't think that iOS and Android are fundamentally at the operating system level more secure than each other. However, I would argue that the iOS platform, the iPhone and the iPad, are more secure generally through procedural security that Apple has implemented. And also because it's a closed source operating system, you've got a lot less fragmentation of OS and OS versions. And I'm going to show you some things around the Android fragmentation side of things. That said, Android can be made secure, but it's, in my opinion, more work. Brief response around a question: what is your opinion of the DoD hardened Android kernel? I do think that that is a good way to go. I haven't done a detailed analysis of it. The real question around that kernel is going to really be about configuration and how you configure the settings and whether users can download apps from Google Play or whether apps are pushed to them. Can they sideload applications or go to other sites? So while it's a good kernel, it doesn't guarantee security. It's really about how you configure it and lock it down. And if you do start opening up, you are open to some of the vulnerabilities we're going to talk about. Question about BlackBerry. BlackBerry, in my opinion, is one of the more secure versions of mobile devices out there. However, what we see on the BlackBerry platform is just, usage is declining, and use of Android and iOS is definitely increasing. On the attack front, most of the attacks tend to be on the Android platform, secondarily against iOS. Now, none of these platforms protect against network attacks and Wi-Fi attacks, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the webinar. Let's continue to look at some of the Android apps that expose you to APTs, and then I'll answer some more of the questions. Fully 9% of Android apps read the contact database on the user's device, and many of them send that contact database in its entirety off to servers on the internet. As we've discussed, this exposes you to advanced persistent threats. It's effectively publishing your Active Directory out onto the net. So my recommendation is that you set risk rules that say that if people are bringing devices into your network that are connected to your AD through ActiveSync, that you only allow those if the apps are reading contact database, they're validated apps from providers that you trust, and anything that's not whitelisted from a provider that you trust is automatically blacklisted until the user deletes that app. That's one of the things we help you do. Fully 12% of apps read your SMS messages. This creates target profiling, again, inside of your organization, where they know who's SMSing whom inside of your company. As we know, phone numbers can be spoofed, SMS source addresses can be spoofed. This allows people to target employees with SMS messages that they will click on and believe come from somebody that they trust. There's another threat on SMS messages. Many companies and financial institutions are using SMS as a second factor of authentication. The username, password, and a one-time password, an OTP that's SMS to you. These apps that are reading those SMSs, some of them are malicious and are sending those SMS messages off the device with the full intent of allowing attackers to log in before the employee. And I'll show you a couple of screenshots of what those look like. One comment, there were easy backdoors to get into the iPhone a couple of versions ago. Well, I guess my comment on that is there are backdoors on lots of devices. We don't know all of them, and certainly with the NSA controversies recently, it's hard to know fully what's on there. I will tell you this. If an iPhone's jailbroken, the chance of it having a backdoor is probably close to 90%. And those backdoors have a common password, an SSH server that's running on them, and there's a common password, and if the user isn't aware of it and they've jailbroken their phone, that basically, if that device connects to your network, you have got a real big problem. And the other thing we found around these jailbroken phones is jailbreak jammers, which I'll talk about momentarily, that prevent MDM products from detecting them, that they're jailbroken. Let's keep moving. This is disturbing. 17% of apps send your device IMEI, and many of them also send your SIM information. This means you can clone a device. You can buy devices from China and India that come with blank IMEIs and reprogrammable SIMs. And once you have a user's IMEI or SIM, you can basically program it, and effectively, you're now them. Now, one could argue that both phones at the same time on a network might have some collisions and that type of thing, but attackers can basically wait till the employee goes to sleep and then turn on their phone, and now they're them. And they're receiving their text messages, they're receiving their phone calls, they're able to make phone calls off that device. 17% of apps are doing this. I got a question from Kelly. Do you have a preferred automated security scanner for mobile devices? My answer would be yes, Marble Security, but there are other ones out there, and I'd encourage you to take a look at them as well. 9% of apps read your phone call history. That helps hackers target your employees. Again, similar in the way that SMS, reading all of your SMS messages, help them target employees. Reading your phone messages and sending that call history off the device really helps create an attack profile in almost the same way that the NSA creates these graphs of who's talking to whom. This helps the hackers and criminals create basically a graph of who's texting whom, who's calling whom, and that makes it very easy for them to target employees with further attacks. This is the scary stuff. 6% of Android apps read your browser history, and we have found a number of them that for sure send your entire browser history off to websites on the internet. This opens the user up to complete account takeover. The attackers now know that where you work, they know what are the internal networks that you're connecting to. They know that if you're running a SharePoint, they know what social networks your employee belongs to. They know what their interests are. They know where their email accounts are if they're using webmail like Gmail, etc., Yahoo. It creates a huge target profile. One of the things we're working on in the research labs right now is looking at if apps are pulling cookies out of the browser. Because if they pull cookies as well as the browser history, then of course account takeover is a given and the employee is completely owned. But I just found it shocking that full 6% of apps are reading your complete browser history. All right, there's a question here that says these app percentages are only legitimate apps, which is true. These are legitimate apps. This is not an analysis of malware. I'll show you some malware and side-loaded apps, but this is legitimate apps. So the question is, why do so many upload so much of this sensitive information, such as SIM? Well, the fact is that uploading SIM and IMEI, I mean, some of these apps are malicious or include libraries where the developer basically is linking in multiple advertising libraries to monetize their app, and yet those libraries have malicious code in them. So they don't know all the code that's actually linked into their apps, and we're doing an analysis of that as well. We're looking at a whole bunch of different app packages that are being linked in and doing a maliciousness survey of that. But yeah, the app developers don't know what's in there. And they link this stuff in, and some of it is definitely malicious and being resold out to attackers for many purposes. It may be simply to enable free mobile phones, hijacking someone's phone number, but it's also in many cases to various criminal organizations or people who resell to them. Now, the main reason people do this stuff, of course, is profiling of users for presumably advertising purposes. However, keep in mind that if apps are uploading your corporate directory through the contact database, you have no control of whether that data is encrypted over the wire or whether that data is encrypted at rest. And I can assure you of this, advertising companies are not real big on security and encryption. It's just not their mainstay. And I will show you an example in a couple minutes. So hopefully that helped answer that. Another question, is there a way to tell what an app is doing if it's sending your contacts info into where? Yes, there is, and that's one of the things that I'll show you a little bit later. Is one of what Marble is doing is analyzing apps both statically and dynamically, finding out what they do, where they send the data. We're also correlating that data with network threat information, so we can tell, for example, if an app is sending data to an IP address that has historically had malicious activity. So it's hosted a botnet, it's hosted malware, it's hosted a phishing site. Then we flag it as risky, and we show that in the Marble app to the user, and we also can flag that to IT so they can block that user until they delete that app. 1.6% of apps try to install other apps on your device silently. They're trying to install other APKs. Depends on which version of Android you're running, whether this is successful or not. But yeah, almost 2% of apps try to install something else on your device without you knowing it. So let's just talk about broadly what you can do to detect and prevent app risks. A cloud service that scans and analyzes apps for malicious behavior and privacy violations, I think, is absolutely critical if you're doing a BYOD type program where you're not just buying devices and whitelisting everything. And I also believe that from that data, you should block users from accessing email and internal web resources until those devices are cleaned up. Now, a signature-based approach, which is what the antivirus business used for many years on the PC simply won't work. It's not scalable. There's way too many apps out there. They're changing quickly. You have to look at things like not just app maliciousness behavior, but you also have to look at how apps change over time, and you need to look at the reputation of the publisher. We find many publishers who've never published an app coming out with one that exhibits risky or malicious behavior. So looking at the reputation of the publisher is important as well. And for a mobile device, you want to do that in the cloud where there's a lightweight client that scans the apps, talks to the cloud and says, are these bad or good, or what should I do? You can't do that scanning on the device. It's just too CPU intensive. There is a quick product question here from Jeffrey. Does your product have the ability to blacklist devices by MAC address or manufacturer? We can do it by MAC address. We haven't done it by manufacturer, but you can do it by OS version and OS security profile. So we don't have a thing that says, hey, Samsung's not allowed, at least yet. So let me talk about the app analysis architecture, and then I'm going to jump into some more of the latest threats that some of them are new in the last week. Effectively, the way that we analyze apps is we scan all of the app stores, the Apple Store, Google, and other marketplaces. We put them into an analysis engine that does static code analysis, and then we have a rating system that looks at the calls that these apps make, and we do call chain analysis. But we do also run them in an instrumented operating system kernel and a sandbox where we can see what behaviors they do, we can see if they change behavior, and we can also see where they're talking to and also analyze traffic, even if it's encrypted, because we're doing it right down at the code level before. We're not doing it on a network level. We're doing it right in the code level. And then we feed that into our app risk engines. We also correlate it with a great number of network data feeds, and we find this increasingly important, is to look at the network riskiness of apps, where they're talking to, has that got a risky behavior, and associate that also with the publisher, because we do find that some publishers, or increasingly some libraries like ad libraries, are sending all this data to certain network addresses where we can pinpoint it through the network traffic. And we can also find out if they're sending it in the clear, because a lot of these ad libraries that are compiled into apps send that data, for example, your contacts, out in the clear. So I mentioned that the Windows malware community has been moving more to onto the mobile devices. In fact, believe it or not, we've seen drive-by malware on Android where sites are infected with bad iframes. It checks the user agent of the browser, says, oh, well, look, that's an Android device, and it tries to send an update APK file to the browser. If the device is configured to allow apps from unknown sources, which many people do because they want to download apps from a variety of marketplaces, that malware gets installed. So you can have drive-bys on Android. I thought this was not possible on the iPhone, but it is. Now, it's a more controlled environment. However, it is possible by registering as a developer to set up a web page which will install an app on an iPhone or an iPad simply by a user visiting a website. It does not have to come from the App Store. And a little bit later, I'm going to show you how to take over an iPhone in a few clicks. We'll save that to closer to the end. Got a question here about the security posture on Windows 8 Mobile. I guess my opinion of that is it's a little too early to tell. I don't think the bad guys are targeting it so much yet. We are investigating it, so I don't have a detailed answer on that or opinion. My suspicion is that it's going to be closer to Android than to iOS as far as the risk, but we will in future months come out with more detailed analysis from the labs on specific Windows 8 mobile security threats. Got another question here about what can an MDM do to help this issue. An MDM can, depends how you deploy it. If you deploy it that says the only apps that are allowed on a user's device are the ones that you specify and nothing else is allowed, and you specify it that it always must connect through a VPN back to your corporate network, then you can avoid many issues. However, that doesn't work so well in a bring your own device environment. Many users want to download apps onto their devices even if it is a corporate device. And I'll show you in a little bit about jammers where they are actually patching MDMs. So our view is that MDM can be useful in many circumstances, but does not solve for a lot of these threats, particularly network threats and when users can put apps on their devices. Now, why is some of this happening? Certainly in the Android marketplace, there's massive fragmentation. What I'm showing you here is a picture that shows different versions of the operating system by device vendor. And there are over 3,500 of these out now. And it depends how you count. Some people actually counted up to almost 10,000 different versions. Each one of these is a different version of Android with a different patch level and has oftentimes been configured by the manufacturer. And that's where a lot of vulnerabilities are introduced. If manufacturers install their own management software, configuration software, you can get a lot of vulnerability. So this fragmentation problem is a big one. And you need to be able to restrict what type of device, what level of operating system and patch level, and what apps are on a device if you're letting them into your network. I got a question about static analysis. Do you have access to apps code for static analysis? Static analysis does not require source code access. So yeah, we don't have to have the source code. Let's see here. Here's hot breaking news from this week. The first Android bootkit has been discovered in the wild. And a bootkit is a type of rootkit that installs itself deep in the operating system. But a bootkit, even if you delete it, comes back after you reboot the device because it's way down in the firmware and can basically come up as the firmware reboots, download a copy of itself, and install it again. So this is just more evidence of attackers coming at the operating systems at the low level as well as the social engineering level of getting users to install malicious apps. Now, how are these apps getting out there? So certainly some are being posted to legitimate marketplaces like the App Store, like Play, where they're hiding it inside of it and it doesn't come live till weeks after the app's been released. But there are also hacked apps posted to market. So what they'll do is they'll download a real app, modify it, and then post it for free on one of these various marketplaces. People will go download it and get infected. Here's a fake Angry Birds. Here's a fake Instagram. These are fake banking authentication apps, and they're branded by the various banks, and these are purportedly giving users one-time passwords that strengthen the security into the banking system, but in fact, these things are not the real OTPs, and they are, through an enrollment process, stealing the user's login credentials. We've also started to see fake and malicious apps be pre-installed on devices, and this is where you need to be careful around, again, what devices users are bringing into your network, and even what devices you purchase, or if you let people use used devices, refurbed devices. So what happens here is hackers download legitimate apps, tamper with them, republish them, and then we haven't figured out the supply chain yet, but they are getting installed on devices from the factory. In fact, this is an example. One of our customers has a fake Netflix installed on their device, a brand new Android device. It's got a fake Netflix, and upon our analysis, we flagged it as malicious because it's communicating with known malicious servers in Russia. And there has been more and more of this happening, and we've certainly heard more about it in the last couple of weeks, but this is a live example from a real-world customer of ours that basically had fake Netflix installed on their device. As far as we know, there are 4 fake Netflix apps floating around on various devices. Could be more, but that's what we know about. Question, have you reviewed these apps in the context of containerization solutions? Yes, we certainly have. Containerization of data can be effective. You've really got to look at the inter-process communication security. You've got to look at the authentication security of how apps can talk into containers. But remember that containerization is designed at solving one problem, which is data at rest on the smartphone, on the mobile device, and protecting it from other apps getting it, or mostly from a user sending it out and being able to blow it away if a user quits the company, for example, without destroying their whole phone. But you have to consider the other risks, which are authentication and access control risks, which many of these apps pose, where they're not just trying to steal files off your phone, but they're actually trying to gain access into your network. Let's keep moving here. We're running out of time. Here's an example of a Trojan. This is a legitimate app. It's a flashlight app. But this flashlight app reads your messages, reads your call logs and your contact database, reads all your phone call logs, and sends that over the internet to a malicious server. Now, users, granted, have to click OK on the permissions, but as far as we can tell, users are pretty much kind of click OK on almost all of these permissions. They don't seem to get in the way of users clicking on OK. Here's some new attacks. We discovered this last week. It's been published on the net by a few people now. Malicious apps being installed over USB. So when people plug their phone into their computer to charge it or to do backups, there's malware on the PC that goes and installs malicious apps on the phone. This example here is designed to target users of certain banks, where they put a Google App Store link on it. It's fake, and when the user clicks on that, it tells them there's an update to a banking application and removes the legitimate one and installs a bogus application to replace it and allow the attackers to steal the username and password to get into the online banking system. Now, not everything is malicious. There are apps that just have poor security, and you need to scan for that as well. We talked about apps including third-party libraries that have security vulnerabilities. Well, just to give you an example, that's how the NSA spies on apps. So this is actually a slide out of one of the NSA Snowden documents that was released recently, which is talking about sniffing traffic that's unencrypted out of ad libraries inside of apps. Here's a couple of examples of apps that the NSA spies on: Candy Crush, Angry Birds. We've heard about a bunch of them in the last week, but these have app libraries compiled into them that communicate data that is non-encrypted, and that's where they're getting it. Now, if the NSA can do it, so can any criminal sitting on a Wi-Fi. So users are very vulnerable to spear phishing. Users are very vulnerable to spear phishing attacks on their phones. We find that people respond to phishing attacks with a much higher ratio on a phone than on a computer, because they can't see the security information about the website. They often have multiple email addresses, some of which have better spam filtering than others. Also, phishing attacks can be delivered through SMS, back to our SMS mining problem with a lot of these apps, 12% of these apps reading your SMS. And users click on that stuff. So we really recommend that you push users to a VPN that is providing the DNS and has DNS blacklisting services to prevent access to phishing sites and malware sites, and also, to track it. And if a site comes up as, hey, that was a spear phishing site, you're able to go back in your logs and look for it and find users who may have clicked on it. Question. Is it worth investing any Android-based products with all the attacks which happens to them? Well, I think it depends on your industry. I think it depends on your security posture. I also think it depends on what kind of security products you deploy. I believe you can make Android pretty darn safe. I think with any security product, nothing's 100%. There's always bad people out there moving very quickly, but yeah, you can. I think the question is also, can you stop Android from being used in your network? Because there's just a huge push by employees to use those devices, as well as Windows phones, not just iPhones. A very important question from Kelly has come across here. Do you think the Seahawks will win the Super Bowl? No, I think the Saints are going to win the Super Bowl. Oh, wait. I'm a few weeks out of date. Yeah, another question, were we tracking the Angry Birds spying scandal? Yes. Another question, is blacklisting scalable? And no, it absolutely is not scalable. Whitelisting can work if you say, I'm only allowing these 8 apps, for example. But that's not feasible in most environments. And blacklisting is absolutely not scalable. It's a technique that you can use, you must use. You can say, for example, I really don't want this particular app, even though our app reputation may tell you, oh, it's fine. You may decide, no, actually, I don't want that risk. I'm going to blacklist that one. So you want to use blacklisting in combination with a behavioral-based app analysis, as well as a behavioral-based network analysis. Last few new things, and then I'll wrap up so you can all get on with your day. This is a new attack, and I received this one directly. Phone phishing. This one was fun. So this was last week. Bad guys basically figured out which phone number blocks AT&T allocates to their mobile phones, and then would call up the phones and leave a voicemail saying, log into myatt825.com, which is basically a clone of the MyATT management site. It takes your username and password for your AT&T account, plus your social security number. Now, what this gives them is access into the user's ATT account, which means not only do they know their name, their address, they know their social security number, they know their username and password, but they also know all the phone numbers of anyone who's ever called them. So very bad attack. Evidence appears to be that they've also targeted Verizon, and they know the phone number blocks of Verizon. Question, can code signing help here? Allow only trusted code to run? Yes, I mean all code that runs on Android and on iOS typically is signed. However, there's a lot of self-signing going on, so you'd have to actually restrict it to trusted issuers of certificates. There's been plenty of examples of people stealing other app developers' certificates, so I would say that code signing can be helpful, but it's certainly not a solution. Again, unless you restrict it down to a few apps. Let's talk about some Wi-Fi attacks. So people are using up to 10 different networks a month, sometimes more. You know, the phone, they're using their phone at home, they're using it at the airport, on the bus, on the airplane, at the coffee shop. All of those Wi-Fi hotspots can intercept and redirect traffic, which subjects you to evil twin attacks, DNS attacks. Again, we really recommend a VPN service for all users on every Wi-Fi, providing DNS to them. Here's a little, if you haven't used it, I'd recommend you go to CookieCadger and take a look, but this allows you to basically sit on any Wi-Fi network and hijack people's web sessions that are unencrypted and just log right into their accounts. This gives you a nice example of what bad guys can do. On the DNS side of things, because most of these Wi-Fi hotspots don't actually manage their own DNS, they're subject to not only attacks against the Wi-Fi hotspot, but poisoning upstream at the ISP. So they can basically inject responses into the DNS higher up and route apps and browsers to different sites. We have found that many apps do a poor job of certificate validation, so they basically are very vulnerable to man-in-the-middle, even though they're doing SSL communications. And finally, related to that, we found that 2.8% of apps actually modify your Wi-Fi settings. That's bad. You don't want apps that are modifying Wi-Fi settings, and you don't want apps that are modifying VPN settings on your users' devices, so you've got to scan for those. And this is just a picture of how we identify malicious sites and correlate it with app traffic. Let's briefly talk about jailbroken and rooting, and then I'll finish up with a couple more questions. We've only got a few more minutes. We know that jailbroken and rooted devices have almost zero security protections. You've basically done a privilege escalation so that effectively you've got root access. Many of these devices have an SSH server installed with default passwords, and if a user brings that into your network, you've basically brought in a port scanning attack tool into your network, which is a very bad idea. A number of products try to detect jailbreak. However, what we have found is a class of malicious apps that we call jammers that are designed to prevent jailbreak detection. They're updated every few weeks, and they will patch out many popular MDMs so that, for example, the jailbreak detect API gets patched out to say 0. No, it's not jailbroken. And this allows employees to use those devices inside your network. And, you know, I think a lot of people do this not maliciously. They don't really understand the risks, but hey, you know, they want some free apps and they want a cool background that they can't get without a jailbroken or rooted device. But you've really got to detect this, and you've got to prevent these jammers from hacking the detection system. So our approach on that is to update our detection all the time, every 2 weeks, And also we take a polymorphic approach. We basically use malware against malware. So we change our detection code every release, every couple of weeks, so that if somebody does figure out how to reverse engineer and patch it, the next update, it doesn't work anymore. I'm going to finish up with how to take over an iPhone in a couple of clicks. Unfortunately, I've got more questions than I can answer. But so let me finish this, and we'll wrap up. And I'll try to take some questions through email. So if you have more, I'll try to email you back with some answers. Okay. This attack starts with a phishing or spear phishing lure. This is a real one sent to a university employee that says, hey, we're updating our spam system. Please download this app. Takes you to a website. Now, it turns out that iOS allows unsigned and unverified profiles. Profiles are what can control the device, apps, VPN settings, etc. And there's a few different categories of apps, but you don't have to have these verified by Apple, and they don't have to be signed by any known or validated CA. You can self-sign these. Okay? So remember, I've sent you an email. Well, in this case, the attacker sent me an email saying, hey, here's, please install this software. I'm told, do I want to install it? Install now. I click install now. Now, on my device, I have a password. If you have a password, you have to type it in, but that's a fairly regular thing that people have to do. If you don't have a password, you're already owned. If you do have a password, you type it in because you're installing new security software. Now, you're partially owned. So in this case, this is a demo that we've set up here, but we've basically replaced iTunes with a malicious iTunes simply by clicking on that web page and clicking OK. So I've replaced your iTunes. What can I do with that? I can steal your passwords. Now, why do you want to steal an iTunes account? Well, if the user's backing up their device, I can basically go recover all their data, including the corporate data, onto another device. A very big risk here. It can change security settings, JavaScript settings, app settings, allow untrusted TLS for man-in-the-middle, install certificates, but here's worse. If the user doesn't have an MDM profile and that website installs an MDM profile, it allows you to replace all the apps, change the OS, delete data, and route all traffic to man-in-the-middle sites. So I encourage you to, if you have further interest, take a look at marblesecurity.com. Take a look at all of our capabilities to help prevent this type of thing in both an employee-owned environment and a corporate-owned device environment on iOS and Android. And I thank everybody for attending this webinar and for all of your awesome questions. And the ones that I didn't get to, I will attempt to get back to you via email shortly. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dave. Great presentation, and we had a lot of great questions that came in as well. And you really went over some very timely research that's been out there this week and in the past month. With that, I do want to extend a big thank you to you for presenting today, and of course to all of our listeners for tuning in. I want to let all of you guys know that this webcast will also be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SC Magazine website. You can follow up with Dave if you like with his email. Until then, please join us next time.